to North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
How are you doing?
Pretty good.
Okay, very important episode this.
Yes. So today we're actually going to interview someone very important, Dr. Peter Brain, who has written a book which we talked about in our second episode last year when we started doing these shows. The book is called Credit Code Red, and so this is the book here. This is the famous book I held up in the debate against Christopher Joy at the end, talking about the foreign debt bubble that we have, and that was our second show. So now, why is this important? Is because most of our viewers may not know Australia has actually two debt bubbles, not one. So a lot of the work you do with DFA and a lot of the discussions we've done so far has really talked about the housing debt bubble. But the second debt bubble, which we did talk about last year, but we probably haven't spent enough time on, is the foreign debt bubble. And so the leading expert on the foreign debt bubble is Dr. Peter Brain, who co-authored a book with Dr. Ian Manning. So basically, the first show we did last year was Australia's debt bomb, and then the second episode was the 1 trillion debt bubble, what lies beneath. And so people can go back and look at what we said last year about that. But just to give people a bit of a sense as to the quantum of foreign debt that we have and why is this unsustainable. So, as of March of 2019, net foreign debt was $1.099 trillion. Gross foreign debt was $2.31 trillion. Both of these in nominal terms are record highs. If you look at our short-term gross foreign debt liabilities with 1 year maturity or less, it's $738 billion. So every year, over a 12-month cycle, we're turning over almost $750 billion. So that's obviously a very big issue if we can't turn over those loans, particularly at the 90-day level. And a lot of that short-term foreign debt is concentrated in the banks, and it's concentrated into the property sector. So it is linked between the the housing bubble and the foreign debt bubble, but the foreign debt bubble has its own dynamics that need to be considered. Now, in terms of net foreign debt as a proportion of GDP, roughly about 57%. The IMF, and this is something that Peter emphasised in his book, the critical red line is about 50% of GDP. That's when systemic risk tends to go up quite dramatically. So we're in that sort of critical zone already. Now, what did I say in the debate against Christopher Joy? We're going to either have a housing crisis or a dollar crisis. And basically I said that all of this macro intervention that we're seeing at the moment, that we've covered in recent shows, it's going to have an impact in terms of the dollar. It's going to have an impact on the in terms of the foreign creditors having confidence in our ability to repay the loans, because obviously with more foreign debt, with a cheaper currency, there's a question as to our ability to service our debts. And obviously one of the big things that I've been nervous about is when we look at Peter's scenario in particular is, a currency crisis. So in Turkey last year, the Turkish lira fell 32% in 3 weeks once foreign creditors lost confidence in the Turks to meet their foreign debt obligations. And in the Asian financial crisis, the South Korean currency fell 40% in 3 weeks. And in both of those cases, in the South Korean case, they required an IMF bailout to stabilise the currency. And if you look at what happened with Turkey last year, they took interest rates from 8% to 24% in a short amount of time to stabilise the currency. And obviously, given how indebted Australians are with 80% of the market on variable interest, if we had to dramatically increase interest rates to shore up the currency and the foreign debt, that means millions of Australians are basically going to be wiped out, very, very quickly. So obviously we're here to meet Peter. Peter has been an economist for over 40 years, and he has a strong track record in predicting crises, predicting the 1991 recession, the 97 Asian financial crisis, which he's been recognised in the press for, as well as forecasting the GFC well before the GFC happened. So, without further ado, welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much, John and Martin.
Good to have you on board, Peter. And I've read your book, and I think it's a very, very important read. I just wish people would really wake up and smell the roses on this one, because it is really big, isn't it?
It is. It's, I guess, I know it's a cliche, but this time it's going to be different.
Sure. Okay. So Peter, so we've got a series of questions we want to run you through. So the
Yes.
the first question is, so there's a quote on page 22 of your book, and I'm going to read the quote. And the quote is, of the 40 or 50 economic catastrophes that have occurred over the past 3 decades in countries with developed financial systems, 30 or 40 have taken place in countries that have significant overseas debts. These crises were generated when the country's creditors came to fear that they might not be repaid on time in an acceptable currency. So basically, in the Australian context, is that quote basically the core essence of your thesis about the potential sort of crisis Australia may face?
Correct. I mean, you summarised it very well in the introductory comments. The issue when you have high foreign debt is the issue of investor confidence, overseas investor confidence, of course. In fact, they're A, going to get their money back, and B, are they going to get the return they expect on their money? Now, what happens when a crisis develops? What happens is basically that investor confidence is undermined. They don't think they're going to get their money back, or at least all of it, and they don't think they're going to get the return. So what happens then? They head for the exits. They start, when their debts come up for rolling over, they don't. They take them out. Now, in terms of the vulnerability of the country, it all very much depends, if you're looking 3 months, 6 months, 9 months ahead, how much debt they have to roll over and what sort of foreign exchange reserves they have to pay out creditors if they decide not to roll over their debt. The fundamental issue for Australia is our foreign reserves are quite low compared to the amount of debt we have to roll over every year. So our foreign reserves are about $80 to $90 billion, whereas the amount of debt we have to roll over, the foreign debt that comes up for renewal each 12-month cycle, is between $700 and $800 billion. So you can see there, if a crisis developed and nobody wanted to roll over their debts, then we could only last a month or so before we'd run out of foreign exchange and we'd have to default on our foreign debt.
So, Peter, look, just one of the points I just want to clarify for the audience. So when you talk about the 80 billion of foreign exchange reserves, you're basically referring to the reserves being held by the Reserve Bank of Australia.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep. So basically, when we have a balance of payments crisis, the institution that's responsible for trying to roll over these loans is the central bank. And obviously, when you look at overseas central banks, particularly in developing countries, that they operate on a principle of having a high level of foreign exchange reserves so that they can sort of manage the balance of payments for the country.
Well, yes, for developing countries, the desired level of foreign reserves are in fact equal to your rollover of foreign debt 1 year ahead. That's what people have suggested is a reasonable rule. Where we are well below that. It's a little bit more complicated. What tends to happen when a crisis develops, there's pressure on the reserves. The government of the day approaches international institutions. Obviously, the most important is the IMF. And they say to the IMF, "Hey, look, fellas, we've got to roll over $800 billion of foreign debt this year. We think if you give us an extra 200 or 300 billion, we can restore, which is very large by IMF bailout provisions. We think we can restore confidence and people will leave their money here. So give us the money." So the amount of money goes up from, say, the $80 billion to, plus $300 billion, whatever it is. And so you can last at least 6 months. Now, that's only temporary, of course, if you don't restore confidence. So what the IMF says, okay, we'll give you the money, but you've got to sign up to our policy agenda. And that will mean we want you to increase your primary budget surplus to 8% of GDP, whatever it is. We want you to do this, that. We want you to free up this, like Greece. We want you to do all sorts of things. that impose very high short-term pain on the economy, as the Greeks found out when their GDP fell 50%. So that's the second round that you go through, and then that has to work in terms of restoring confidence. But you've plunged the economy into a deep recession. Well, the Greeks obviously the standout case, where GDP might fall anywhere between 5 and 8 or 9 to 10% to stabilise the economy without defaulting, and that's misery by itself. And then the question becomes, well, how is this? Then with the pain being imposed on the economy, then the political debate opens up. People say, "Oh, we're imposing all this pain on the economy. You know, our health benefits are going to be slashed in half because the IMF requires it. We've got to spend, half of, cut our expenditure on education. Free this, free that has to go. Everyone's got to pay for it. Subsidised medicine for the middle class gets ended. That sort of stuff." And people say, "Well, is this worth it? Why are we taking on the debt of nationally onto the public exchequer for debts that were incurred by the private sector, as you said, mainly a lot of the banks? Why are we doing that? Why don't we just default and save us the cost of that?" Well, that's going to be the debate, and then people would then say, "All right, we can default. That's fine. But the trouble is with that is we are likely to be shut out of capital markets. So, in other words, we won't be able to borrow for anything. So that's fine if our exports equal our imports. In other words, if the things we want to import, like pharmaceuticals and these sort of essential things for life, if we can pay for that with our exports, then the default option is more attractive. You've got to accept, though, that there's going to be a lot of political pressure. We'll be very much constrained in our future growth to exports equal imports until we can get some sort of resolution to the problem. But if we've got a reasonably strong balance of payments, default is an option. But it's still going to be painful, but not anywhere near as painful as accepting the debts of the private sector onto the public account. In other words, accepting, say, $1 trillion of bank foreign debt onto the budget, the budget.
So what happens to the exchange rate in that scenario? Presumably that takes a bath, does it?
Okay. Now the question you're alluding to is, when will all this happen? And there's a lot of it's a vicious feedback effect. So investors start losing confidence. They start taking their money out. We have a net outflow of foreign capital. The exchange rate starts to slip, starts to go down. Exchange rate going down leads to increase in the foreign debt in Australian currency terms. So all the indicators of suddenly you find your foreign debt to GDP goes from 57 to 65. Very similar to what happened in the first 6 months of the GFC, when the exchange rate slid down to the low 60s. All the indicators went AWOL, and very much would have led to a very severe balance of payments crisis if it had not been for the expansion of the Chinese economy. That put a floor under the exchange rate. However, without a floor being put under the exchange rate, it slides down and down. Your foreign debt goes up, more people want to go out, until you reach the point where the economy is likely to collapse, just go stick like a stone. And I would imagine that would be not far south of about 60 cents to the dollar, US dollar. Now, then what you do is, in effect, you default. You've got to spend your capital account. You can't have on-demand demands for capital going in and out of the country. You've got to go back to the regime we had before financial deregulation, where you had to make application to the Reserve Bank to take funds overseas, and you fix the exchange rate. And what you fix the exchange rate then would be a consideration of minimising the real income loss on the society, because you're increasing the price of imports and exports to the domestic market, those goods that are allocated to the domestic market, vis-a-vis giving the economy some hope that they will shift resources into net trade. So as the economy has some hope in the years ahead of growing at some reasonable rate. The PPP rate, in other words, the rate where we're competitive with the US economy on relative cost terms, is about 68 cents. So I guess you'd want a fair margin over that to give the economy a big boost. And if the IMF was involved, they would suggest something like, I should imagine 60 or 56 cents, something in that range.
Sure. So Peter, so I mean, look, you've said a lot there. So there's a couple of elements I just want to sort of crystallise for the audience. So one is, you said once the foreign debt becomes a systemic issue, we can default. Now, one example in the GFC that did default on the foreign debt it was Iceland. Now, Iceland went through a sharp depression, but they were able to come back from it. And now their foreign debt as a proportion of GDP was, like in the hundreds of percent, much more substantially in proportion compared to us. But they said to the foreign creditors, we're not going to pay. And so, we've done some shows where we've talked about Ireland, where Ireland basically tried to bail out the banks, and 10 years on, they've got what you've said. They've got all of this private sector debt on the public balance sheet, and a lot of Irish either citizens or immigrants have said that trade-off wasn't worth it 10 years on. And obviously, the people in the government in Iceland basically said, no, we're not going to go down that path. So one is default, and then two is that if we don't default, and we want to transfer private sector debt to the public balance sheet, and this is precisely what Philip Lowe at the RBA has been promoting about fiscal expansion, the capacity of the federal government to take on more debt. Why is he saying that? Because he wants these private sector debts, mainly from the banks, to be transferred to the public sector balance sheet. If we were to do that and we lose control of the balance of payments, well, then basically we lose all sovereignty domestically, and we basically transfer all of our domestic policy settings to international institutions like the IMF, and they're going to start calling the shots about what type of economy, what type of lifestyle do we live in Australia. So they're basically the two choices that you see for the country. Is that fair?
That's a good summary. I would just add the additional complication is that either choice, default or transfer, won't be completely our own decision. Even in the Iceland case, the British government got very upset that the British bank holders, deposit holders in Iceland weren't going to get paid. And I think they either threatened or did dispatch a destroyer to Iceland. I don't know what it was going to do. But in the Australian case, we'd have huge pressure on us. Especially to the extent that the United States would have to accept that their investors in Australia weren't going to get paid. So what tends to happen there is that the US president ring up the Australian Prime Minister and say, if you dare default, it's all over, mate. We're pulling everything out, all our defence, everything, forget about it. You're dead. So that's what they'd threaten. So it would be a very rough time.
Sure. Now, and Peter, so yeah, I was going to say that Martin and I did a show last September where we talked about this precise scenario. Once the foreign creditors call up, what would we do? And we both said on that occasion we would take depression. We would actually take the default because, and Martin famously said we need to alt control delete on the economy. We basically need a reset to the debt. because if you transfer the debt to the public balance sheet, all you're doing is kicking the can down the road, and basically you're going to exacerbate the problems moving forward. So if you actually want to face our demons and actually try to get the economy into some sort of sustainable footing, and Martin last week interviewed Steve Keen, and Steve's position is that the economy should have about a third of the debt that it has today. So if we were to follow the Keen prescription, we basically have to wipe out 2/3 of the current debt load that we have, just so we can restore the economy into some sort of sound fundamental premise. And the only way you're going to do that is through a default bankruptcy process. And so, putting the geopolitics and the military aspects aside, and obviously national security is important, but from the economic point of view, my position is take the depression, wipe out the debts. Yes, it's painful, but it's the best long-term solution that we have. When I put Martin on the spot last September, Martin also said he would take the depression, knowing that it comes with significant economic and social costs. But truth be told, we think, and obviously the conversations I've had with federal politicians, is that they won't do that, and they will actually go for the debt transfer.
Yes, except going for the debt transfer means loading up the federal budget with $2 trillion plus or more, because it'd be a crisis. And by the time it got to the debt transfer, the exchange rate would be around about, in the 50s probably, and you'd be looking at not 2.3 trillion, you'd be probably looking at something closer to 3. And they're massive numbers. And any politician yes, put it this way, politicians would have to earn their money in considering all that.
Yeah, they tend to want to take the easy route, and they think at the moment that just doing more debt is the easy route. But
yes.
Of course, the point is there's a consequence.
I think our numbers are so large, we'd have no option. But I think we'd try and do a deal. I think we'd try and find a muddle way through, I guess, where you try and buy off the people that you had to, like US bondholders, and let the rest go to hell and take the consequences. I think that's what you would do. You try and of course we're not completely without assets. We are an important strategic element in the US defence system, so we can play that off as well. We don't have to be. We're not totally subservient, and that's the conversation that would be had. And the conversation would run something like this: all right, we owe you guys 700 billion or trillion or whatever it is, 800 billion. Let's say we pay 400 on some sort of basis and forget the rest. That's what I think a rational expectation would be, that the debate would go.
And do you think our ability to continue to export, let's say the iron ore price stays high, and the fact that the exchange rate actually would drop, would actually benefit us as well as part of that scenario?
It would certainly increase the profitability of the commodity exporting companies. But you've got to remember that the exchange rate going down isn't harmless on the general economy.
Right.
I mean, I used to know the rule. Roughly, if your exchange rate drops 10%, and you want to not have inflationary, hyperinflation flow-on effects. In other words, people have got to take a cut in their real incomes to bottle up the inflationary pressures from that. Well, they've got to take a 0.2 percentage to 0.3 percentage point cut in their real incomes. So if you're looking at a 20%, you're looking at a 2 to 3% cut in real incomes alone because of the exchange rate decline, simply to minimise the inflationary consequences. That's very large.
Sure. Now, one of the questions I have, Peter, is that so there have been some comparisons between Australia and Japan. Now, Japan had a big bubble in the 80s. It sort of collapsed in around 88, 89. And then so since then, they've had a slow deflationary process that they've gone through. And some people have thought maybe Australia will suffer the same sort of process that the Japanese have. Now, when I look at the Japanese economy and I look at them versus us, the big difference is that we have a big foreign debt, we have a big current account deficit, we've got a structural trade deficit, whereas the Japanese have been running current account surpluses and they're a net creditor. So, is it fair to say that because the Japanese don't owe anyone any money outside of their country and we do, the comparisons between Australia and Japan are not appropriate examples, and therefore the consequence of the Japanese situation is not, that won't happen to us. I mean, it's going to be much more severe because of our foreign debt load.
No, I don't think that's right. There's very little comparison between Australia and Japan. Japan's initial problems is they were one of the tearaway economies after the war, the post-war recovery, and they got to the point by the late 80s where they couldn't. They had the growth opportunities they could exploit, given their productivity differential with the US, had closed, and so they had reached American productivity levels, about 90% of American productivity levels, which is quite high, given that Japan's a much smaller country than population-wise than the US, and they had nowhere to go. So they came up with this brilliant idea. That will keep growing as we will keep. It wasn't brilliant, I mean, being sarcastic. A brilliant idea that they would keep growing by just pouring in more and more capital so they could keep up going with their 4 to 5% growth rates. But of course, they ran straight into the demographic ceiling. I think their working age population now is falling by about 1% per year. And they just hit their ceiling. But in trying to flood the place with financial capital, to flood the place with capital stock, they locked the excess, if you like, liquidity in the system, and that's been one of their big problems for about 20 years, trying to get rid of it. A totally different situation.
Okay, that's very interesting. And so the consequences here would be more severe simply because of the size of the debt problem we've got, the fact that our central bank resources are somewhat limited relative to the debt. And we also know, of course, as you said earlier on, a lot of it's actually cycling quite quickly, isn't it? On 90-day terms.
That's right.
This stuff is something which could blow up quite quickly. And once it starts to go, my sense from what you were saying was that there are a series of cascading consequences that makes it very difficult to stop the implosion. Is that sort of a fair interpretation?
The secret here is to follow on from John's comments about the two bubbles are linked. He said how my rule of thumb is about half the foreign debt's gone into the banks. A lot of that's gone into support elevated house prices in Australian capital cities. So what we've done in our brilliance to try to keep the economy growing is we've let the banks to do that. When you think about the absurd case of exposing Australian households to full international risk.
Yep.
And that international risk will come home in spades because the main determinant of our medium to long-term interest rates in Australia is the US economy. And frankly, the US economy is a basket case for a number of reasons. It's not recognised as such, but it is. It's got massive amounts of excess liquidity from 8 years of quantitative easing, which the markets won't let the central bank mop up. It's an economy operating at its ceiling capacity of output, and it's got massive fiscal and monetary stimulus to keep it there, which is even if inflation only goes up by 0.5% because it's being pinned against its ceiling, you take that together with the risk of, say, military action in the Middle East driving up oil prices, and you'd have a massive, inflation could tick up over 3.5%, and all of a sudden it's on for young and old. We're back to the 70s. And interest rates would have to rise, and those interest rates would be immediately impacted here. But it's much more than that. It's because of the high foreign debt, and Australian households have to pay it. There's no option. But it's more than that. They've also got out of control fiscal policy. Said even with a modest cutback in the growth rate from what the Congressional Budget Office has assumed for projections of the US deficit, which is basically 4% for now and forever because of current fiscal settings, you just have to do a slight decline in growth, built-in stabilisers, a loss of taxation revenue, and so all of a sudden your projections for the stock of the deficit goes up to 6% of GDP, 6 to 7, and the stock of securities outstanding on the federal government bond register it goes up by 2025, 2026 to be more than what was the case at the end of the Second World War, which is about 106 to 107% of GDP. So it's all, and it'll happen. It has to happen because all the settings, and you've also got in the US equity markets, which are about 90% overvalued because of all the excess liquidity in the system. And you've also got a corporate bond market, which is now its highest on record, about 30% of GDP. It's gone up about 6 percentage points since the GFC. So all these things are going to force up US rates through what we call a risk-off shock, where there's a flight from any medium to long-term assets, whether it be private or public. And that fully will be reflected in the local market because for 30 years we've driven this economy by exposing the Australian household sector to the full risks of the international economy, and it'll all come home to roost.
So Peter, probably got a couple of questions before we wrap up. So one is, because I obviously, just so the audience knows, I mean, you and I have spoken in person on multiple occasions over the last 12 months, but there was a recent interview where you said, I think this was on the ABC, about when this crisis is likely to occur. Now, back in March, Martin and I did a show where we talked about the inversion of the US in terms of the US yield curve for the US bond market, and we said that based on the last 7 recessions, the recession and the crisis could happen within 27 months, which would take it out to about June of 2021. So I'm that's sort of the thinking I've got. This crisis is going to happen sooner rather than later. I think you've said that. Depending on political developments internationally, it could happen in 2020 or could be delayed to 2021. So is that fair to say that we're looking for this Armageddon scenario of it could come to a head next year or the year after, in your view?
That's correct. I think I said on the ABC that if it looked like a left-wing Democratic candidate was going to get up next year with a very expansionary policy agenda, then I think that the crisis would happen. The catalyst of the crisis would start from middle of next year. If it looks like Trump is going to be elected, then I think it'd be well likely that the markets would postpone the crisis on the grounds that was the best option for them. Fair enough. But as soon as he was re-elected, and all these other things I've talked about come into play through 2021, 2022, they will say, holy mackerel, this is not sustainable. And then what will happen then, we'll have a risk-off shock, which is a bit different from the inverted yield curve. In fact, it's the reverse, where you have a flight to currency, flight to safety, through only wanting very short cash or very short-term securities. It's a bit different. I think what the technical name is a risk-off shock, or I think in the popular economic literature, a Minsky moment, where markets fundamentally readjust very quickly of where they want to go. And the markets will then be saying to the US administration, we are going to raise interest rates. In other words, we're not going to hold any more medium or long-term paper until you get your fiscal and monetary act together. And what we want is massive reductions in the deficit. They'll say they don't want to buy tax cuts, but that's impossible in the US because taxes are so low and the wealthy are so wealthy. So it's very much going to be almost a civil war situation in the US where the different groups try and sort out what is going to be done, and the market will keep on imposing the pressure, i.e. by keeping interest rates high or taking them higher, until the politicians come up with a deal that they can live with. It gives them hope that down the track the American economy will become more sustainable. That is my scenario, and I think all that's going to happen if Trump's re-elected. It's going to have to happen very soon after the election cycle, in the first 2 years of his second term. That doesn't mean to suggest that I actually, from a political dynamic, I actually think for the best situation of the US is for Trump to be elected. I say that because if you're going to get fundamental changes you need in the US, he has got to be totally discredited. He will not be totally discredited, I don't think, because he's captured the Federal Reserve and will do what he wants to do and keep the economy bubbling along by the 2020 election. I don't think so. And if a Democratic candidate was elected, they probably wouldn't carry all the institutions of government they need, and they would get the blame for the crisis that will ensure. And that means America would be locked into a 4 or 5 election cycle of utter dysfunctionality, which would be totally, it would just be totally so bad for us. It's best Trump gets re-elected. The crisis happens after that. He's discredited. A new administration comes in with a new agenda to straighten things out in line with the market pressure that will no doubt be there. And we might get some resolution over a 2 or 3 election cycle. That's my reading of the political cycle.
Sure. So last question, Peter, is if you were Prime Minister today and you were trying to implement policies federally, but or even maybe even at the state level, where you can try to mitigate some of these risks and some of the potential fallout for the average Aussie, what would you be wanting to do? Because the reason why I ask that is that Martin and I focus a lot on a lot of the problems that the economy faces. Some of our audience wants us to start talking about solutions about what we should be doing now. What are the policies that we should be seeing from the federal government today? I mean, what we're seeing at the moment is they're throwing the kitchen sink at the bubble, trying to keep it all together. And I think we're getting, my view is Martin's view, and I think we're getting from you that we all disagree with the current policy direction coming out of Canberra. So what policy direction should we be seeing from Canberra to mitigate the risk that you outline in your book?
Well, firstly, the Reserve Bank's current policy view is bizarre. What they're saying is, we can permanently reduce unemployment by loading up the economy with even more debt. I mean, the reality is, if Victoria was a country, it would have the highest household debt to GDP in the world, about 135%, because it's got the highest in the country. We're second highest in the world overall as a nation. So what the Reserve Bank is saying, look, the solution to your problem is, to get a bit more growth out of the economy and a bit lower unemployment rate, let's go out and it will load you up with even more debt, which could not be any more stupid than you could imagine. I mean, yes, it may work for a year or two. It may add another 10% to household prices compared to what others be the case. But we're in a situation where the essence of Australia, to stabilise the Australian economy, one essential element is to allow the household savings ratio to rise. So you've got to let housing prices fall. You've got to let them not borrow so much, so they let the savings ratio rise, which will lead to unemployment and lower growth. But you've got to do it. Trying to temporarily put off that adjustment mechanism only makes the adjustment mechanism worse. So the current RBA policy is absolutely bizarre. In terms of federal policy, I wouldn't have put in the tax cuts. What we need is, if you like, a prudence in the sense that if all these shocks are going to happen, you need as much. Well, tax cuts won't affect for 4 years, so they're relevant, but you want to have you want to be building up as much ammunition you can, so when the shock does occur, you have some resources in which to deploy. And I would be running a much more conservative fiscal policy.
Peter, thank you very much for your time today. I have one last question. If people want to get a copy of your book, what's the best way to do that?
I'll get it on Amazon.
Okay. We'll put a link through because it's a must read from my perspective. So I think in summary, we are all agreeing that the current trajectory of the RBA is pretty nutty, that the foreign debt issue that we face is most significant, and in fact it's probably not fully understood by way of the risks involved, and the outlook ahead looks pretty dodgy.
I think that sums it up. In fact, very scary, actually.
Yeah. Peter, thank you very much. John, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Martin North, Peter, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.